Hello, friends. This is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I get to sit down and have just a fun talk with other writers. And the conversation goes anywhere where it's going to go. We do not script it. I do not send out questions ahead of time. I do not prepare questions for myself. It is purely like reminding myself who I'm talking to, reading up on them, making sure I understand kind of the arc of their career, the best that has been portrayed either from their publicist or online. And then it's just like, hey, I just met you. Let's have a great conversation. And we accomplished that today. Before I get to today's guest, just a reminder that my company, Unbound Writer, has a seminar coming up in March, a 4-hour seminar about committing to your novel. And that's going to be in Denver, Colorado. So you can check that out at unboundwriter.com. And you can also check out my offerings for one-on-one coaching with me, as well as self-guided online courses. All right, so today on the show, I had Georgia Jeffries. So Georgia is fantastic. We had a really fun conversation here the day before Thanksgiving. It's kind of the only thing I have going on today, aside from starting to get food prepared. So it was nice to take a break and talk to Georgia. She is a writer of Emmy Award-winning drama and acclaimed noir fiction. So Georgia has just spent her life in the industry, as they would call it, in Los Angeles. So she moved from Illinois to California when she was a girl, and she kind of stayed in California. She worked as a journalist for American Film before writing and producing the groundbreaking female-driven dramas Cagney Lacey, China Beach, and Sisters. So she has just been entrenched in writing rooms and screenplay writing and teleplay writing her whole life, but she is also a novelist, and her debut book, which is just out now, is gorgeous looking. It's called The Younger Girl, a historical thriller based on a true crime. And that just came out, I believe, in October of 2024. She had 2 other novels before that, one of which was all set to go until the company went out of business. And boy, do I relate to that, because that happened to my first published book as well. In my case, the book actually came out and then the publisher went out of business about 6 months later. But we really didn't go a lot into her journey as a child to wanting to write. We ended up talking so much about the field of screenwriting and teleplays, and then just kind of talking shop for a lot of the conversation, and then wrapping up with a really, really, I think, well done by both of us, making it up part of this show that included wolves. So, but she was fascinating to talk to. She's got tremendous advice. She's also teaches at USC Film School. So she knows what she's talking about. So if you're an aspiring writer, especially, this is going to be a great conversation for you to listen to, because Georgia Jeffries knows what she's talking about. I think you're going to like this one, folks. This is my conversation with Georgia Jeffries.
Your home office is a lot more organized than mine, Bart. I'm impressed.
It feels chaotic to me. Well, my dog's not in here, so it's a lot more calm than normal. So she gets booted out for the recordings.
What kind of dog do you have?
He's a 2-year-old golden retriever.
Oh, yeah. So, he takes up some room then.
Yeah, and we just, it's snowing here. I'm in Colorado, so we just went out and played in the snow, so she got some exercise. So hopefully she's going to be quiet on the other side of the door.
That sounds fabulous, actually. Snowing in Colorado. It's drizzling here in Pasadena.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in LA. I grew up in Ventura County, Westlake Village.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I was there until I went off to college. I haven't lived there since, but it always holds a special place in my heart. And of course, a bunch of my friends still live there.
Do you come back often
No,
to family
not very
and friends?
often.
No.
Yeah, and it's funny. LA is such a bizarre place, and when you come back, it just feels more and more like just exotic and alien.
There are some exotic parts to LA. That's an interesting description of it, actually. I think it's become more exotic with the years.
It's probably true. Now, how long have you been in Southern California for?
Really, since I graduated from UCLA. I mean, when
Oh,
I
okay.
when I started UCLA, but I was raised in Illinois until I was about 12, and then my
Okay.
parents made the trek
Yeah.
across the Rockies and to the Promised Land, and that was the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. So I went to high
What was the
school.
impetus for that move for your parents?
Um, it uh, it was a complicated issue, but primarily because my dad was moving to a new job.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Got it. I
And
mean,
I
that's
think, and also, I think my mom particularly had dreams of the Golden Land. You know,
yeah.
she was eager for the move, and my father was not so eager. But things just unfolded that was the next chapter for us, and I think I was excited at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, of
You know,
course. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
and the Bay Area is obviously very, very different than Los Angeles.
Oh
I
my
lived in San
goodness.
Francisco for a couple of years too, and my folks lived up in the Bay Area in the Walnut Creek area.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah.
but but also very different from Illinois. So what were your do you
Oh
have you remember
yes.
your impressions as a kid kind of
Yes.
heading out
And
over
I will
there?
say we didn't live far from your parents. We lived in the Danville area.
Oh, sure.
And
Yeah.
so
Beautiful,
it
beautiful East
was the
Bay area.
East Bay. And at the time, really kind of out in the country, right?
Right.
But
Right.
yeah, my first impressions as a 12-year-old in starting middle school. I mean, I'd graduated early from eighth grade, and so suddenly I was in middle school and not too far from high school. Was that everybody else to learn how to fit in, and I was very much a nerd and loved my studies, and uh, and California had a whole different vibe.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a very accurate way of saying it. Sure. Yeah, it's a place you have to kind
yeah,
of figure out, and it's such a massive state, and it's so disparate in its
hmm
ecology and its geology and its geography and its culture. Like you can go drive an hour and it's just again totally foreign, you know?
it is its own country. It
Yeah.
truly is, in so many ways. I mean, it's this abundance of riches, and because it's so vast, and different groups of people culturally through the decades and the centuries have settled in different parts.
Right.
Um, You know, I went back to, I've gone back to Illinois several times. I actually went back for a grade school reunion years ago, which was, a fascinating experience. I
Huh.
recommend it for a short story, and which I have not yet written, but it was, yeah, it was actually a very enlightening experience. And I remember I was asked at the time, would you ever want to move back to Illinois? Because everybody was very impressed with the fact that I was not only living in California, but at that time I had already was doing well in the film and television business as a writer producer.
Yeah.
And I said honestly that I don't know. I wouldn't want to move back because that was a chapter in time. But absolutely as true is Illinois will always have a very special place in my
Sure.
heart. I mean, I'm a
Yeah.
Midwesterner,
Yeah.
born and bred at least until I was 12, right? So I
Right.
carry a lot of those values and that outlook. And I think because my parents were Midwesterners for generations, right? So
Yeah.
it's with me. It's with me.
And that attitude can be culturally very different than not only California, but certainly Los Angeles in
Yeah, I
terms of,
think
and this is just gross characterization, but in
right.
terms of just kind of wholesome, honest, as opposed to game playing.
It's yeah, a lot of game playing, and I think in any megapolis, I've only lived in New York for about 6 months. I was there when I was working on a CBS series years ago, and of course that was very exciting to be in the Big Apple. But yeah, there's so much ambition and longing in LA for that
Yeah.
reinvention and the big chance and the big move and the big life. And so I'll have to say, I think I was more grounded,
Yeah.
perhaps, than some other folks I met in the business because I'd had that, let's say, more normal upbringing.
Right.
Certainly, yeah, certainly I wasn't in the industry circle as I was growing up, where there are certain private schools one goes to, there are certain social groups that one gets involved in because it's all related to how you move and advance in the business.
Yeah.
That was interesting to me, and I'm glad I wasn't in that. By the way, I feel more
Yeah,
balanced.
I
Yeah.
mean, having the right. I mean, and one never knows what the right attitude is going into any kind of situation. So you just kind of hope
No,
that
one never does know,
you
right?
just hope that you have the right one. But it's
Yeah.
interesting because in the entertainment industry, whether it's film, TV, or novel writing, um, there's the aspirations and then there's the reality, and you try to situate yourself kind of somewhere in the middle because you don't want to be so negative that you manifest failure, but you want to be
Yeah.
realistic and say like this is not an easy game to get into and prepare for years and years and years of nothing happening. But if it's your passion, you got to keep following it.
Yeah, I will say that I was never negative, and I will say that I was probably naively optimistic, and that was a good thing in
Yeah,
retrospect
right.
because
Naivete can be powerful, as long as you have some actual confidence in there, and then some ability to suffer the slings and arrows when they inevitably
yeah,
come.
I think I really did have a strong faith that it was a meritocracy, and that if I worked hard enough and long enough and deeply enough, and of course, I love studying. I
Right.
was always recess was my tough class in school. I love the studies, right? So
Right.
it was all about the work, and I learned about the game. I learned about
Mhm.
the networking. But just because you learn it, you observe it, and you know how to play it up to a point, doesn't mean that you are of it,
Right.
or that you
Right.
become it. And I think that's the thing. Some people, in their great ambitions and hopes and goals and dreams, kind of become part of that game. And that's dangerous. That's
It's
dangerous.
interesting. Yeah, and it's such a dangerous thing to think about anything being a meritocracy.
How
You know,
innocent of me. I told you I was born in the Midwest, right?
but it's because you ultimately, and this has taken me 20 plus years to figure out on the novel side of things that yes, like you have to be strong at what you do. That doesn't mean weak things don't get completed and published and made into that happens all the
Yeah,
time,
all the
but
time. Yeah.
it's so unpredictable. I mean, I look back at my career and I think there are things that you know, books that I've thought of mine, some of my favorite books that did okay, not great, and then other ones really connected and it surprised me. Like I'm like, wow, I remember writing that and thinking it was kind of a simple story, and that's the one that connect. So I have no perspective on it. So the best you could do is to just be committed to your craft and not think about the other stuff so much. Just keep the content coming.
Not thinking about the outcome, but staying very much in the moment of creating work. I'd like to know if you could cite an example, which of those books connected more, perhaps, than you anticipated, and was that a learning experience for you as a writer? Did it affect at all what you wrote next? Or I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. So really the one that's coming out in January, my 10th, is is going to sell more.
Congratulations. I have to
Thank you.
say, congratulations, Carter. That's fabulous.
It's going to sell more than any of my other books have. I already know that because of things that are happening, and I think
Uh,
about it. I remember thinking I shifted then to write that book from a book that was way more complicated and I struggled with, but I love it dearly. And again, it did okay, it didn't do great. And then I remember thinking I want to write just an angry, in your face, unforgivable thriller. All my books are thrillers, but and I think that and it's written from a 30-year-old woman's point of view exclusively, first person present tense. And I think something about, I read an early review calling it justified female rage. And I'm like,
That's
that's
high
interesting.
praise. That's high praise.
It
I
was
want you
meant
to
as
know, because
praise. Yeah, it was
yeah,
meant as
yeah.
praise. And I'm like, I think it's just the timing of things. I think
Uh-huh.
there is a lot of
Uh-huh.
justified female rage out there. And I
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
necessarily going for that, but this woman's story was, she was being fucked with and she wasn't going to take it anymore.
And the timing intersected. And I
I
and
guess so. Um,
I have learned, that's one thing I've learned in my career, the importance of timing.
right. Which you can't
It
control.
you have no control over that. And they're just extraordinary to me how different doors opened, and they opened really quickly at a certain point in time. And then other times where, regardless of the work, the effort, the circle of the team, that supports us as writers, whether it's agents, lawyers, et cetera, network publishing people, you're knocking on the door, and it still doesn't open. I
Right.
mean, you have the deal, but it doesn't get the green light, to use
Right.
the LA parlance, regardless of all those moving pieces that are supporting us. So the idea that you stepped into the first person of a young woman, I find is very admirable,
Oh,
that you took that risk as a writer. I don't know how often you've written in first person before, but in The Younger Girl, I wrote both in third person.
mhm.
Um, and I guess it's a historical fiction on several levels, because the 90s might be perceived as historical fiction now,
Right.
especially as things are unfolding so
Yeah.
quickly in our country. So it was 96. And then the diary that I wrote from first person from Eldine Younger's
Hmm.
um, point of view ranged from her age 12 to age 20, shortly before she was murdered. And for me to write in first person, that was a new thing for me. I'd
Yeah.
always written in third person. And I found that the more I wrote in first person, the more I enjoyed it. And I also brought me so deeply into that character. How often have you written in first person, Carter?
So it's interesting. I started, and again, and I'll make sure that the listeners understand your history, which is primarily, television, film, up to this point now, you're a debut
And film
novelist
journalism before that. Uh-huh.
and film
Yes.
journalism. So
Yeah.
third person is kind of what you do. That's the form that one writes in for teleplays and screenplays and things like
Always.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so, I started writing and I started writing out of the blue with zero education in it. So, my mind was, yeah, third person past tense. That's how books work. And
Yes.
it
Yes.
was
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
my fifth book that I started writing first person present tense female point of view.
Did you
And it
say
just
your
it was
third book? Did you say
my
your third?
fifth book.
Your fifth book? Okay.
And it was just a totally different experience. It just flowed out of me. And I look back now and I'm like, oh, I think that's synonymous with finding your voice, is finding the
Yes.
tense and the point of view that is
Yeah.
just organic, that you don't even know about until you
Right.
try. And
Right.
I dabbled with secondary points of view in present
Mm-hmm.
tense.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
now I exclusively write first person present tense, usually just one point of view for the entire book, sometimes two. But it's just what I do best. It's my voice. So I try not to mess
So
with it.
you've discovered that, and I think that's wonderful. And I'm working on a short story now, very intermittently with all the marketing that is involved with.
Yep.
You can teach me on that. Um, but the short story I'm working on, I started in third person, and I'm now alternating to first person. In fact, I've gone back and edited and begun with first person, and so I
Interesting.
have a view of how I'm going to go into some third person to escalate the mystery. And then, so that's exciting to me. And I'm really looking forward to some downtime over the holidays to
Yeah,
getting back to do that. So,
it's a
so the
great
fact that,
challenge. Yeah.
yeah, and I do think what you said, it's discovering our voice on a deeper level,
Right.
perhaps,
And
right?
and trusting yourself. And so
Trusting.
the book that I struggled with, the whole point of view was from a 20-year-old woman who was a savant in 1987,
Oh,
and I second guessed myself. I'm like, I don't think I can write this first person present tense. I don't think I can get in this person's mind enough because she's so different. And so I wrote the entire book third person past tense, and my editor's like, I am not connecting with this. And I
uh-huh,
realized what I had actually done was made it more difficult to connect with this character. So I
uh-huh.
rewrote the entire manuscript first person present, which took me 4 months. And then
Oh,
that's what
quickly.
got published. I'm like, I should have trusted my instincts because this is what I do best. And I doubted myself.
Well, isn't that part of being a writer?
It is
It's
self
easy.
doubt, self
That's part of
loathing,
it for
imposter
some of
syndrome.
us writers. The self-doubt. You have to move through the self-doubt. Um, I've talked about that actually in some of my thesis classes at USC Cinema. That in a sense, to be a writer, I found, just speaking from my personal experience, you have to have the hubris of believing you have something significant to say to even put word one down on the page that you know you will put out into the public eye. But one also, if one doesn't have it to begin with, learns humility.
Right,
And that's the writing game because
right,
rejection is part of the game,
right.
regardless of whatever level. Well, not, I suppose the certain grand master writers don't have to deal with that rejection at a certain point in time. But I think most of us do, just in
Right.
terms of the
And it comes in
marketplace.
all different forms.
It
And
comes in all different forms.
I mean, it can be like the lowliest form would be a random one-star review, but that's still data. That's still information. That doesn't mean you have to absorb it. But, like you were saying, when the door closes and you don't get greenlit, even though all the moving pieces seem to be in the right direction, I think it's so important to be curious about that. Like, why didn't this happen? What
Always,
can I learn
always.
from this? How do
Yes,
I, maybe this is telling me this is a blessing that it wasn't meant to be because something else is going to. How many times you hear that story? I didn't do this project. I got rejected, but I would have been able to do this major project had this one come through.
that's
Um,
absolutely true, Carter. I've experienced it in my own life. I've
yeah,
seen it in some colleagues' lives, but absolutely true. And that is the beauty of stepping away from the marketplace and
right.
really getting straight with ourselves and say
Yes,
where are we at this moment in
right. Don't
time
chase the
as creative
market.
artists. That's right, and that's a real gift to have that awakening and awareness. And I think it sometimes it takes um, new writers or younger writers, and thinking of some of my students, a while to really
Yeah.
recognize um, that's a greater lesson of life, not
Yeah.
just about writing. That's a life lesson.
But with your students, I would think, because I'm always curious about that too, because when I fell into writing and quite literally it just turned on one day in my 30s, it was just this weird experience I had. I haven't stopped since. But I was a professional, a corporate professional. I had a full-time job and I
Oh,
figured
that's
out in my
interesting.
life how to write. And I still do this, write an hour a day, 7 days a week. And that's how I do a book a year. And but if I'm a student, if I'm one of your students, and this is what I'm studying, this is my business, this is going to be my industry, then you're thinking much more about how do I live with
Hmm.
this? How do I make money off of this? So you probably can't help thinking about the market, the game, as opposed to because I teach my students
Yeah.
look, let's just write the story you want to write and forget the noise and be true to yourself. And I think that's a very easy, I think it's true, but I think it's also a very easy thing to say to people who have full-time jobs and they're not like
Right.
waiting for an advance to try to help pay the bills.
So true. Yes. So that's interesting because USC Cinema is very much a professional school.
It is. Yeah. I've had a
Very
great
much a
friend who went
professional
there and
school.
yeah.
Like Annenberg is a professional school, as opposed to the graduate school in our letters and science division or other divisions.
Right. Or an
Yeah.
MFA, for example, where it's all about
Right,
the craft and not the business.
right. And actually, I teach in all of our faculty in the writing division of cinema, teach BFA students as well as MFA.
Okay.
Although some of us have a more specific focus. And my focus for years has been BFA thesis. I created that class actually for television at USC, but MFA thesis for both television and feature. It depends on the particular focus of the student. But you're absolutely right. As soon as that student is accepted in a very competitive process,
Mhm.
they know that they're not just getting their college degree, they are preparing for their livelihood.
Right.
And in that sense, I think that's
Right. It's really a
particularly,
trade school in a way. This is
yes,
what you're
it
going to be
is.
doing.
It is. And I think that's particularly challenging for the BFA thesis students because they enter at 17 or 18
Right.
and
And who the
they
hell
are
knows what you're
out
going to do with your life?
in the marketplace by 21 or 22. It's much different for the MFA thesis students because I would say probably at least at least half to two-thirds of our MFA thesis students, maybe three-quarters, have all had experience in the marketplace with other jobs in the corporate field or whatever. Sometimes they come from the other arts, but so they've had that life experience. And I would say, so that's one of my greatest challenges, and I'd say responsibilities as a teacher, particularly for the BFA thesis students, to help them try to find a balance and faith that the process is going to be a process. Of
Yeah.
course, they don't know it personally until they get out in the marketplace. And the vast majority of them do have day jobs. They have to have day
You
jobs, of
have to
course,
have a day job.
as soon
Yeah.
as they leave. And the majority of the time, that becomes work. They all have internships by the time they graduate. That's required. And they often start out as assistants on different television shows
Yeah.
or PA assistants. Some of them do become baristas, to
Yeah.
help support.
Right.
But the vast majority have had enough training, and there is a great deal of training at USC and also with the alumni network. We have a very strong network that they have their plan once they get out, and they have their portfolio. Every student has a portfolio of at least five scripts by the time they
Wow.
leave. And
And
some
then
of them, yeah,
I was just going to ask, and then do you, as the teacher, I'm sure you kind of are at some degree aware of the progress of many, many, many of your ex-students. And can you look back and say, like, yeah, about 20% of them do anything of significance in the field and 80% of them don't? I have no idea, but I'm curious.
yeah. I wouldn't dare to use a percentage because that's because some students stay in touch, some do not.
Right. So you just don't
And
know
and
for a
and
lot.
we do check in. I mean, that there is a very, very supportive alumni network in which we invite them to stay in touch, let us know what they're doing. I will tell you that I've had a number of extraordinary classes, and I say that extraordinary in the sense of the work ethic and also the bonding, the community. I
Yeah.
think that's probably the greatest gift for the
Hmm.
students, that they have a safe sanctuary community in the class. And the class of '07 MFA thesis, for instance, I'm still in touch with almost everyone in that class. They
Wow.
kind of check in. So it varies, it
Yeah.
varies.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, it's a journey. It's a journey
Yeah.
for all of us. And you can't separate it from their own individual life journeys any more than we could separate it from ours, right, Carter? I
Right.
mean, in terms of when I decided I was going to work on my first novel, and which is after one of those television pilots didn't get the green light. And I had an idea for a novel that was actually inspired by a true life criminal case here in Los Angeles.
Hmm.
And that's what I was going to write. And it took me, I was doing that off and on between my day job of a
This is the
lot
younger girl
juggling.
we're talking about, not another.
No,
Oh,
we're
this is
actually,
something else.
yeah, it was actually Younger Girl is actually my third novel. It's the first one published.
Yeah.
It's not my first publishing deal. My first publishing deal was about 5 years ago, I guess it was. It began for a company called Adaptive Books and Adaptive Studios.
Mhm.
And they specialize in developing intellectual property. And I had an HBO script that was just a smidgen from being greenlit because
Mhm.
the executive had left. But it was always one of my favorite scripts, military political thriller, actually.
Mhm.
And they and I decided that would be a great limited series. But first, I wanted to write the book.
Hmm.
And so my manager at the time took my proposal to Adaptive Books, and they hired me to write the book.
Oh, okay.
And
Got it.
then it was a hardcover book. I mean, it
Well,
was a whole new story.
yeah.
This was 350 pages versus 120 scripts. So it was
Right.
a whole big
Right.
vision. And it was scheduled to be published in 21, November 21. And just a few months before the company dissolved after the weight of the pandemic, there
Yeah.
were a half a dozen of us authors who still had deals, all hardcover deals. Because I don't know if you know Ryan Gaddis, the
Mhm.
LA author, but he was one who had just published before before the pandemic came upon us, And they were just all the deals dissolved. And
Yeah.
then my attorney had to get involved because with getting the rights back.
Right, right, right. And
Yep,
then
yep. And
you get
so,
the rights back, because that happened to my first book. My
yes,
first three didn't sell, and then my fourth was the first one that published, and the publisher went out of business like 6 months after.
very similar, right?
Yeah, yeah, totally.
What a
And
heartbreak. Yeah.
but you find out this shit happens all the time,
All
and
the
it
time.
it's
Yeah,
just part
all
of
the
the
time.
industry.
All the
Um,
time. But the first novel, just to answer very quickly, that was it's an LA noir. I'll just call it's an LA noir, and it's based on a kind of infamous 1980s one night stand called LA's Mr. Goodbar Murder. And my family actually knew the young man who was accused of the murder.
oh,
It
okay,
yeah, it's quite a tangled web,
yeah.
and but it very noir. And I had a really interesting time writing it, and I had a big New York agent on it, and we
Hmm.
got a number of rave rejections, went into the drawer. But I think I'm going to bring it out because I think it's timing, you know?
Right, right. It's timing, and right, exactly. And it's all of it is it is learning. And
Right.
I'm curious about you with such a deep background in non-novel writing, but your whole world has always been writing.
Oh,
And now
storytelling. Yeah,
in
yeah,
storytelling, and then you sit
yeah.
down to do it in novel form, um, which is obviously a totally different challenge. I'm sure some parts easier, some parts harder, um, but also just you're writing all the time. Do you feel like when you sit down to write a novel, you're like, oh my God, can I just watch a show? I'm so tired of writing.
Actually, it's just the opposite
Hmm.
because the screenwriting has been my day job for so long. And I have to tell you, the first screenplay I ever wrote, I was referred to an agent, and he read that script, and he actually said to me, "You should be a novelist. This is so overwritten." And it was terribly overwritten, And then I did go back to him with the second screenplay, and he did sign me on that, thankfully, and it was through him and one of his clients who optioned that I became a member of the Writers Guild. Um, but also my first novel draft was terribly overwritten. It was so exciting to not be receiving network notes,
Right, right. To be able
notes
to actually
from,
describe something.
yes, and to create and to use location as character, which I do in my scripts, but of course it's always very, very defined, very defined. It's less is more always.
Right,
But I will say, learning dialogue on my very first television series, which was my film school, less is more for dialogue.
right, right,
And
right.
dialogue is now one of my joys to write. I think I was always strong with characterization, even back in the early days of gross overwriting. It was the structure I needed to learn. And just as I needed to learn the structure of screenplay writing, I needed to learn the structure of novel writing. And I think by the time I got to my third or fourth draft of that first novel, I was learning a few things about how to shape it. Yeah.
Right. But there's much fewer rules, I think, with novels. Like novels, you can kind of do anything and it either works or it doesn't work. I think with screenwriting, I think you can do, but there is more structure. I was having this conversation literally yesterday with a coaching student because we were talking about the differences like between like a movie and then a novel. And because I was talking about exactly what you're saying, less is more, especially with thrillers and with describing things. I'm like,
Yes,
look, you
yes.
have a movie and it opens with an establishing shot. What what an opportunity with one camera swoop to give you so much information. Now, if you're going to sit down as a novelist and describe that opening shot, the tendency is to over describe it, to give way too much information. And I'm like, the reader doesn't need that. The reader kind of can see it in their head with a few words.
Right.
And you're losing people because you're just going on and on and on about the
Yes,
mountains or
yes,
whatever.
yes, yes.
And what a luxury for a movie, especially with a great DP, to like be able to like give so much information with zero dialogue.
Oh,
that
yeah.
the novelist is challenged then to do the same thing through exposition, and it's really hard to do.
Yes, well, as I explain to my students, don't ever use exposition, only use character reveal.
Right.
And
Yeah.
character revelation comes in, I think, most strongly through conflict.
Right. Right.
Conflict. And again,
Totally.
screenwriting 101, I learned on my very first series. And I think that probably the greatest gift that screenwriting gave me to bring to novel writing is that I think in scenes.
Yeah.
I think in scenes, as opposed to just giving free rein to all that luxurious internal monologue, which some
Right.
books do, and it's exquisite lyrical writing, and I enjoy reading it. But for me, I like a certain pacing to
Right.
books that I read, and I also want to feel that I am going deeper and deeper into character and understanding of what the stakes are. So
Right.
those basics of screenwriting, which are stakes and conflict. Um, I thrive on writing conflict.
Right.
You thrive on writing angry women. Oh, I've written a few angry women scenes too, Carter. Let me
But I
tell
mean,
you, it's very freeing.
everything is conflict. I
I
mean,
got to
that's
get
the
to the
heart
angry
of.
man, though, Carter. And my next one, I've got to get to the angry man. Right.
I've done that too. But I think trumping all of that is emotion, because I think without the emotion, none of the stakes matter. And
Absolutely.
I,
Yeah,
as I'm
absolutely.
writing, and I think that's where first person for me lets the emotion come out very subtly, because it doesn't take much. And I think you do have to be kind of naturally an empathetic person to pull it off. But I'm always checking in, how is my character feeling? Because how many times have I read a book with a tremendous plot, but I don't care what happens because I'm not
No,
connected. And that doesn't mean I have to like them. That doesn't mean I have to feel like I'm similar to the character, but I have to care about what happens to them by some intrinsic sense of emotion.
absolutely. I agree
That's
with
hard
you.
to do.
Absolutely. I don't read those books anymore. I mean, I've read them at different times just to, learn more probably about different points of view and styles of writing. But if I'm not invested in the character, life is too short. What am
Right.
I going to take away from the book? That's
Right.
always, I want to have an experience, some kind of transformative, maybe too strong a word, but sometimes, reading can do that for you. Some kind of insight at the very least. Some
Right.
kind of insight when I finished reading that book that I did not have before. I mean, of course, the pleasure of reading beautiful words and learning one writer to another, that's part of it.
Right.
But the story itself, the story itself is paramount, really.
Right. And it doesn't have to be, you're never going to write the original story. You can write a great variation, I think. But I
Right,
think
right.
if you focus so much on like the plot, and this is different than anything that's ever been written,
Oh, no, yeah.
then you're going to lose yourself, as
It's
opposed to
artificial.
like, yeah,
Yeah,
it is artificial, and
it's
it
artificial.
jumps off the page, that artificiality, I think,
I think so
because
too.
and you
I
find
think so
yourself, I'm like,
too.
I'm just not connecting, and I sometimes you can't even tell why you're not connecting to it, but the novel, and as the novelist, there's no magic formula, right?
No,
It takes instinct, it takes time, it takes just a lot of practice, a lot of failure, and you start to get this sense of like, all right, I think this is what my character would do, and this makes sense. But it takes years, I think, to
it
figure
takes
that out.
years. And again, that's part of the life lesson as well. What do you think is the biggest takeaway from the time you wrote that book, the first book that was published? I mean, you said
Yeah,
you wrote a couple that weren't, and where you are now. I mean, I can hear that you have discovered your voice, you're really trusting it. But it sounds like with every book, uh, you're taking a new adventure in terms of wanting maybe to go further or deeper than you went
yeah,
before. Yeah. I mean, you're
yeah,
prolific in that sense because you really are, because you came to it in your 30s as opposed to in your 20s,
yeah,
right? I mean, yes, a lot of MFA students, and I'm not talking about cinema, I'm talking about so many writers go to get their MFA in creative writing now, and so they take a particular path.
yeah.
But I hear from us, you and I, that we use a lot of life experience in our writing, and we've come to different parts of our writing Certainly I have now 3 chapters from film journalist to screenwriter to novelist, and they've all
Right.
overlapped in certain ways, and in a sense they still do. So
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I think the biggest takeaway is to just it was to always understand why I was writing. And then and that's what, when I coach, that's what I spend a lot of time with my students is like, really, let's talk about the why, because this is a really tough industry.
it
Why
sure
are you
is.
doing this? And then they give me the answer. I'm like, all right, that's the top level superficial answer. Let's start digging into this. And for me, I remember thinking, like, it took me some time, and I remember thinking, like, I don't ever not want to do this. Whatever happens and whatever money comes or doesn't come, this is what I can't picture myself ever not doing this for the rest of my life. And so once I got to that level, then it became very easy to be like, write what you want to write. Why not have fun with this? It's so hard to do. Why not just enjoy the journey? And so I set out every day, and I don't outline. So I go to my hour of writing, and I'm like, what happens now? And to me, it's all instincts. What would I do in this situation? Am I having fun doing this? Am I getting scared doing this? And if I can tick all those boxes, then I don't even know if this book is going to sell, if a publisher even wants it, but I love it. And if it doesn't sell, then I'll write something else. So I think coming to those terms with the ethereal nature of the industry has really helped me to kind of let go. And the moment you start letting go is the moment things start coming in. And I am fascinated by that.
That's a beautiful thing, in the beginning with that first novel, well, it was a kind of an overall outline. I knew the beginning, I knew the ending. I didn't know too much in between. I've never outlined a novel like I do the story treatments
Sure.
for screenplays. Never have. I've done like little high points of scenes that I know I want to get in there, but I also write. I don't write sequentially,
Oh, that's interesting.
always, and particularly in the younger girl, and with
Yeah.
that first person, because I was writing it stop and starting over a period of time with another novel assignment, and of course the teaching and so on. I could go weeks, where months where I'd be working on other things, but then I would not be able to get to sleep at night, and I'd go into my writing room and I'd just write, and it was almost like channeling,
Yeah.
and I never wrote those diary entries in sequence. I just
Hmm.
would write it and I didn't even know it was going to be a diary initially.
Oh, that's so
That came to
interesting.
me in the last 2 years. I was really like I was just channeling that character who was a real person who lived and died under tragic
Right.
circumstances. That's what I was. So that was very freeing to me. And I love what you said about and I do that more and more, especially with my always with my short stories. And then I just go in there and let it flow. And if I start to get a little scared, like, wow, where's this going? And then I kind of
Right.
think, well, I'm glad I wrote that. Wow, where did that come from? I want more of that. That's the
Right.
fun
Right.
part, right? It
It
is not
is.
at all conscious. It's not at all conscious. It just, as you said, it's instinctual. And so you and I we know that works for us. Yeah,
Yeah,
it works
and
for
it doesn't work for everybody. And like I look at my outliner
us.
friends, and it's about 50-50, and I'm in awe. I'm like, how does your brain know? And they look at me, they're like, how do you just sit down and not know and just write something? I'm like, I don't know. That's just so but you have to not force it, right? You have to be true to
Can't
who,
force it. You
and but
have to
you
be
have to
true to
go
it.
through that act of discovery. And that might take books and books and years and years and years, and that's okay.
It
And how many
does.
times people probably ask you, oh, this is your third book, but it's your first published. Don't you want to go back and try to do something else? And you might, but you also look at it like that. Those 2 books made me able to write The Younger Girl.
That's
It's not
absolutely
a
right.
waste.
It's not. And the fact that I had to deal with the second one, that was very comforting. And
Totally. Yeah.
so, but it's interesting. It's the first one, the LA Noir, that I think that the timing for that maybe. So, yeah. So when we talk again, Carter, I'll give you an update on
Exactly.
all of that. I noticed you're wearing a MASH t-shirt there. Were you a fan?
I watched as a kid. I watched way younger than I should have been watching MASH, which was even though it was a comedy, it was a very intense show. But we're
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about the late '70s, and I was growing up in LA, and we used to go down. They used to film it in Malibu, and we used to go down and you could go tour the set. And then of course there were those terrible fires that destroyed the set. I
Yes,
think it was like
yes.
their penultimate season perhaps. And so they worked that into the show that the camp burned down. But I remember touring that place after it burned down and it was just so depressing.
Well, that's a very
Um,
vivid memory. One of my colleagues, one of my faculty colleagues, that was his very first show, like
oh,
a couple years out of the army. He was actually in the army, and then he and a pal from the army started writing for MASH. Isn't that
wow.
interesting? I
I
guess
mean, what a
toward the end,
tremendous show and not
toward the
afraid to
end
be
of the
experimental.
run. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was great. Well, Georgia, our time here has flown by, but before I let you leave, we're going to do our own little storytelling. This is the making up
Okay.
part of the show. And everybody has that exact same clenched jaw, okay sound
Oh,
when
is it
I
that clench? Ooh, let me loosen it up. Oh.
uh I've picked three books kind of at random from my bookshelf. You're going to choose one book. We're going to choose a random sentence from the random page. I'm going to
Okay.
read that sentence, and that will be the first sentence in maybe a 2 minute long short story. I'm going to read that sentence. You're going to give me the next sentence or two, or whatever comes to your head of what happens next. I'll do a sentence or two. And then when it completely goes off the rails, I'll just kill it. Um,
Okay.
so I've got, I'm going to ask you to choose one book. I've got Kent Krueger's Fox
Oh
Creek.
wow. Oh wow.
When
Oh,
I
they're not
died
your
for,
books. Okay.
they're not my books. No, they're
You're
just random books off
showcasing
my
it.
bookshelf.
You're showcasing other authors. Okay. Oh good. Okay.
When I
Yeah.
Died for the First Time by Tim Booth.
Hmm.
And Simon Scarrow's Blackout. So it
Yeah,
doesn't matter what the books are, just
no,
choose one.
I'll go with William Kent Krueger. I actually had one of my short stories published in an MWA anthology, and he had
Oh,
one, and I was very honored to be in the
yeah.
anthology with one of Kent's
I
stories.
did
Yeah, and
a,
he's a Midwestern guy too.
he is, yeah. I did a signing and then I had a conference and he was signing right next to me. And I had like two people and he had like 50. And I remember I finally just stood up and I said, "Hey, Kent has said I can sign his books if you want me to." And he started laughing. So
He's
then
got a
he
great
actually
sense of
signed this
humor.
book.
Was that in
Um,
Colorado? Huh. I wonder if that's in Colorado. You did that, yeah.
I forget where that was. So give me a number between 1 and 370.
37.
Okay, I'm going to look at page 37. I'm going to choose a sentence that might work for the beginning of this. Um, all right, this is very basic. So I'm going to read this, and the character's name is More So, just
More
so it
so?
makes
How
it
do you, oh, Morceau?
close. Morrieseau. More So.
Not so close, but okay, French. All
So
right.
the French is all I know. Uh, so here's a sentence. Morso eyes the ground. So
And what he saw disturbed him.
he took the toe of his shoe and kicked the dirt around the body, drawing a thin line completely around it, as if the body were to disappear, he would still know the shape in which it had originally fallen.
He closed his eyes. He wasn't ready for what he was going to see next.
His instincts made him crouch next to the body and want to extend his right hand to check for a pulse, but he knew there wouldn't be any. He sucked in a deep breath and held it as he opened the vest covering the corpse to reveal the horrific wound underneath.
And then he heard a sound. It wasn't distinct at first, but it sounded almost like a child. Crying? Laughing? Was he imagining it? He turned to look over his shoulder.
It wasn't quite dark in the woods, but it was heavy. The kind of light that just weighed on you, making you want to go inside. What he saw behind him wasn't a child, but a wolf. He didn't even know wolves were around these parts.
The wolf bared his teeth, paused, ready to strike. Should he hide? Should he move toward the wolf to threaten the wolf? He'd never met a wolf before. What in the hell was going to happen next?
His instinct told him it would be okay. He would be okay. This would all be okay. But his instinct didn't prepare him for the sight of 3 more wolves coming out from behind the trees.
The circle of wolves expanded. They were a family. They were working together. He was alone, the way he'd always been alone. And is that what it comes down to at this moment in time? That he will never be able to move through a group that is much stronger than he is.
Oh, I think we call it that. That was beautiful. See, that was emotion coming in at the end, right? Now I care what happens to him because he's like, that's exactly right, right? Like to think about loneliness instead of fear at that moment is such more of a profound thought, because it's so much sadder.
Well, we did this together. Carter, this was really interesting.
It's a great exercise, right?
It's a great exercise. It's a great exercise. And we each brought some new element to it, which is, I didn't know where it was going. And
right. That's the whole yes and kind of part of it. We have to accept each other's premise.
Yeah. Thank you. This was fun to play. This is recess. At recess I enjoyed instead of laboring over the page. I like that a lot.
I like a podcast where we just kind of talk shop and it's not about, tell me everything about your book. It's just about connecting with you and just talking about maybe where our lives overlap and connecting to each other. So I really appreciated talking to you today, Georgia, and congratulations on the younger girl. It looks phenomenal.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you a quick question. You're in Colorado. Are you going to Left Coast Crime? It's going to be hosted in Denver, as you probably know, in March. Yeah. Okay.
I've never been to Left Coast. I know that I usually go to BoucherCon every year, and I usually go to Thriller Fest every year. But I actually didn't know that Left Coast was going to be in Denver, so I will try to check that out for sure.
I think it's around the 15th or so.
Okay.
There'll probably be a lot of snow still on the ground. I've never been to Thriller Fest, but I'll be at BoucherCon next year. I've
New Orleans.
Different times back and forth. New Orleans, right? New Orleans.
Awesome.
Yeah.
See you there. Yeah. So great talking to you, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Great talking to you, Carter. Yeah. Thanks
Take care.
So much.
All right, that is it. That is my conversation with Georgia Jeffries. And I told you that story was good. It was creepy. I could see the wolves. I wanted to keep going. It could have gone for a long time. I think it would have been pretty fascinating. Did the wolves kill the guy? That's what we don't know. I don't think the wolves killed the guy. I think the guy was murdered, and I think the wolves could smell it, and that's why they were coming out. And then they spotted our hero, Morrisseau, staring at the ground. Please check out Georgia Jeffries and go buy her book, The Younger Girl, but you can just go to her website, georgiajeffries.com, and you can read all about her and subscribe to her newsletter and check out her events. And you can do the same thing at my website, carterwilson.com. And you can also head on over to unboundwriter.com if you're interested in my upcoming seminar that's going to be live in Denver in March, or my one-on-one coaching or my self-guided online courses. That's it for now. I am off to go do more Thanksgiving-y things. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks, as always, for listening and or watching. And another episode will be out just next week, as always. And in the meantime, take care.